For decades, archaeologists believed they had the answer to one of humanity's greatest mysteries. When did people first arrive in North America? The answer seemed certain, carved in stone, accepted by every expert in the field. The scientific consensus was ironclad, reinforced by decades of research, supported by university programs worldwide, and defended vigorously by leading scholars in the discipline. But in 1973, a team of researchers descended into a Pennsylvania rock shelter and made a discovery so shocking, so impossible according to everything science believed, that it would divide the archaeological community for generations and fundamentally challenge the very foundations of what we thought we knew about human migration and settlement. And it all started with a curious groundhog, an animal that accidentally uncovered secrets that had been buried beneath Pennsylvania soil for nearly 20,000 years. This is the story of how one animal, one observant farmer, and one quiet patch of Pennsylvania soil ended up challenging what the entire world thought it knew about when humans first set foot on the North American continent. It is a story of persistence, curiosity, controversy, and the remarkable way that history can unfold when we least expect it, often in the most ordinary of circumstances. The Groundhog Hole that changed everything is located in Washington County, Pennsylvania, just 30 miles outside of Pittsburgh, in a region known as the Appalachian Foothills. The land there is beautiful, rolling and green, cut through by Cross Creek, a waterway that has shaped the landscape for countless millennia, sculpting valleys and depositing sediment that would eventually preserve the evidence of human occupation. Above this creek, protected by a massive sandstone cliff overhang that provides natural shelter from the elements, lies one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. Today, it is called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and it stands as a testament to the remarkable story of human persistence, discovery, and the way that simple observation can lead to profound understanding. The rock shelter would become ground zero in a scientific revolution that challenged decades of established theory and forced the entire archaeological world to reconsider its fundamental assumptions about human prehistory. The conventional wisdom before 1973 was almost universally accepted throughout the archaeological world, with a uniformity that bordered on dogmatism. Humans had arrived in North America approximately 13,000 years ago, crossing the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, traveling across what is now the Bering Strait in pursuit of game animals and new territories. These first people, known as the Clovis people, were sophisticated big game hunters who pursued mastodons, woolly mammoths, and other massive creatures across the continent, leaving archaeological evidence scattered across North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Clovis culture was marked by distinctive projectile points, carefully flaked stone tools with a characteristic central groove or flute down the middle, a feature that made Clovis points instantly recognizable to any trained archaeologist. These tools demonstrated remarkable craftsmanship and showed evidence of a culture that had achieved considerable technological sophistication despite living in an ice age environment. For decades, this theory seemed ironclad, unassailable, beyond serious challenge. The evidence for Clovis was substantial, the dating appeared solid through multiple scientific methods, and no credible alternative explanation seemed to fit the facts. Every respectable archaeologist in North America accepted this narrative as truth, teaching it to students, publishing it in peer-reviewed journals, and defending it against any hint of doubt. The Clovis first theory had become gospel, so ingrained in academic circles that to challenge it was to risk one's professional reputation, academic advancement, and the respect of one's peers. But the story of Meadowcroft begins not with academic debate or university excavations conducted by prestigious institutions with unlimited funding. It begins with a farmer named Albert Miller and his curiosity about the land he called home, a curiosity that would ultimately change the course of archaeological science. Albert Miller was not a professional archaeologist with advanced degrees or institutional credentials. He was a practical man, a farmer who worked the land that his family had owned and worked since 1795, nearly 2 centuries of continuous occupation on the same property. But he was also something more than that, something that professional credentials cannot grant. He was a man who read widely despite his limited formal education, who possessed an active and inquiring mind, and who harbored a deep, almost intuitive suspicion that his property held secrets far older than anyone in his community understood. Growing up on this land, walking these fields and hillsides day after day, season after season, Miller had become convinced through observation and study that Native Americans had inhabited this area long ago in prehistoric time, stretching back much further than conventional history acknowledged. He studied local history carefully, read about indigenous peoples and their cultures, and developed a genuine fascination with understanding the deep past of his region and the people who came before European settlement. This curiosity would drive him to make one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, a discovery that would require patience, wisdom, and remarkable restraint. On November 12, 1955, On what was otherwise an ordinary day in western Pennsylvania, Albert Miller was walking beneath a massive rock overhang on his property when something caught his eye, something that would change his life and the course of archaeological science forever. Near a groundhog hole at the entrance to what he suspected was an ancient animal burrow, small objects were scattered across the ground. Miller bent down to examine them more closely, his heart beginning to race as he recognized what he was seeing. What he saw took his breath away and confirmed decades of suspicion and careful study. There were flint flakes, the byproducts of stone tool manufacture, scattered in patterns that suggested purposeful human activity. There were pieces of burnt bone, evidence that humans had prepared and consumed meat at this location. There was charcoal and burnt soil, the remains of an ancient hearth, where people had warmed themselves, cooked their food, and gathered together in community. Suspicions had been correct all along. His land held the remains of human habitation, the physical evidence of people who had lived at this location in the prehistoric past. But the question was, how old were these remains? Were they a few hundred years old, or did they stretch back into deeper antiquity? Miller understood that this discovery was potentially significant, a finding that could contribute to human knowledge about North American prehistory. He also understood something else that proved absolutely crucial to the preservation of the site and its scientific value. He knew from his reading and his understanding of human nature that if he revealed his discovery publicly, looters and amateur collectors would descend on the property, destroying the archaeological context through careless digging, removing priceless artifacts for personal collections, and rendering the site scientifically worthless through their activities. So Miller made a decision that showed remarkable wisdom, restraint, and understanding of how science should be practiced. He carefully covered up the hole, marking the location with precision, and committed himself to the long and difficult task of finding a professional archaeologist who could properly excavate and study the site using correct scientific methods. What followed was 18 years of patience and determination, an extraordinary display of commitment to truth that few people would have sustained. For nearly 2 decades, Albert Miller searched for an archaeologist willing to investigate his groundhog hole discovery, contacting universities, writing letters to prominent scholars, and pursuing every possible lead. This might seem like a long time, but consider the challenge Miller faced and the obstacles he encountered. He was an amateur, a farmer without academic credentials or institutional connections, lacking the credibility that comes with a doctorate or a university affiliation. The Clovis first theory was so firmly entrenched in the academic world that suggesting the existence of earlier human occupation in North America was tantamount to professional suicide for an academic archaeologist. To take seriously the claims of a local farmer about pre-Clovis occupation would be to risk not only professional standing, but also funding opportunities, publication in prestigious journals, and respect from colleagues. Why would any respectable scholar risk their entire career on the claims of a local farmer who had no formal training in archaeology? The incentives were entirely against it, yet Miller persisted with remarkable steadfastness through rejection after rejection. He wrote letters to universities, made phone calls to archaeology departments, and attended lectures when he could get the opportunity. He spoke to anyone in the academic world who would listen to him. Most dismissed him politely, nodding while mentally categorizing him as an amateur crank with nothing of value to contribute. Others never responded at all, leaving his letters unanswered and his calls unreturned. But Miller refused to give up on his dream of seeing his discovery properly investigated by qualified professionals, convinced that he had found something important that deserved scientific attention. While waiting for a professional archaeologist to take an interest in his site, Miller pursued an alternative strategy to preserve and share local history. Beginning in 1969, he began creating reconstructed historical villages on his property. He moved period buildings from around the region onto his land, recreating what frontier life and rural life had looked like in different eras. These villages featured period-appropriate houses, churches, schoolhouses, and blacksmith shops. Miller's goal was to help visitors understand the history of Western Pennsylvania through experiencing these recreations. It was a creative way to celebrate and preserve local heritage, while he waited for his groundhog discovery to be taken seriously by the academic community. But this work, however valuable, was just a holding action. Miller's true obsession remained the rock shelter and its secrets. Then, in 1973, after 18 years of searching, Miller finally connected with the right person. Dr. James M. Adavazio was an anthropology professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Unlike some of his colleagues in the archaeological establishment, Adavazio was open-minded about the possibility of pre-Clovis occupation in North America. He was willing to listen to Miller's story and examine the artifacts. When Adavazio first looked at the object Miller showed him, a prehistoric flint knife, he was astonished. This was no amateur's misidentification. This was a genuine archaeological artifact. Adavazio recognized immediately that Miller had found something important. Without hesitation, he committed the University of Pittsburgh's resources to a systematic excavation of the site. The excavations that began in 1973 transformed our understanding of human history in North America. Adavasio and his team of graduate students from the University of Pittsburgh approached the site with meticulous care and scientific rigor. They employed cutting-edge archaeological methods, careful stratigraphic excavation, multidisciplinary analysis, and extensive funding to create a comprehensive picture of the site's history. What they uncovered as they dug deeper and deeper into the rock shelter was extraordinary. Layer after layer of human occupation was revealed. Each layer told a story of people who had lived, worked, hunted, gathered, and survived in this location across thousands of years. The most shocking revelations came when this team submitted their findings for radiocarbon dating, a process that would fundamentally challenge everything the archaeological establishment believed. Carbon dating is a scientific technique that measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials like bone, charcoal, and plant remains, allowing scientists to determine the age of materials with remarkable precision and accuracy. By analyzing these materials from different layers of the rock shelter, scientists could determine how old the human artifacts were with remarkable precision, creating a chronological timeline of occupation. The results were absolutely astonishing, almost beyond belief. The deepest cultural layers at Meadowcroft, containing stone tools and evidence of ancient hearths, dated back not to 13,000 years ago as the Clovis. First theory predicted, but to approximately 19,000 years ago, pushing the timeline of human occupation far deeper into the past. Some of the burned bone and charcoal from the oldest layers suggested human occupation extending back almost 20,000 years, suggesting that people had been present on this landscape during the last ice age itself. These dates predated the Clovis culture by an enormous margin, by 6,000 years or more than enough time for entire civilizations to rise and fall. In one fell swoop, Adavasio and his team had produced evidence that seemed to completely overturn the Clovis first theory and rewrite the narrative of human arrival in North America. Craftsmanship and sophistication. The careful flaking of the stone demonstrated that these ancient tool makers possessed considerable skill and knowledge about working with stone. Other artifacts recovered from the site included small blades fashioned from polyhedral cores, sophisticated bifacial tools, pottery, animal bones, plant remains, and evidence of cooking fires. The archaeological record at Meadowcroft was remarkably complete and detailed. What made these findings even more revolutionary was what they suggested about how these ancient people lived. The Clovis people, according to the conventional theory, were big game hunters who pursued massive creatures like mastodons and woolly mammoths across the landscape. But the evidence at Meadowcroft told a different story. The animal remains found at the site included deer, elk, and other medium-sized climate that archaeologists had previously assumed characterized the period. They had established a semi-permanent settlement beneath the rock shelter, suggesting social organization, planning, and intentional occupation of a known location over many generations. The implications were profound. If humans had arrived in North America 19,000 years ago or earlier, it meant that the conventional timeline of human migration was wrong by thousands of years. It meant that the first people to reach this continent had accomplished this feat without the technology and resources that later cultures possessed. It raised questions about how these people arrived, what route they took, and why they came to North America in the first place. Were they following migrating game animals? Were they fleeing some catastrophe or conflict? Did they come by land across the Bering Land Bridge, or did they travel by sea along the Pacific coast? The Meadowcroft discovery opened up entirely new lines of questioning about human prehistory. The reaction from the archaeological establishment was not immediately celebratory. Instead, the discovery sparked intense controversy that would continue for decades. Many prominent archaeologists refused to accept the Meadowcroft dates. They pointed to potential problems with radiocarbon dating, suggesting that contamination from coal humates or old carbon in the soil might have skewed the results toward older dates. Some critics argued that the artifacts themselves were ambiguous, that they could not definitively be proven to be human-made rather than naturally occurring. Others suggested that the stratigraphic integrity of the site had been compromised somehow, that the layers might have been disturbed by soil movement or burrowing animals. The academic establishment was deeply invested in the Clovis first theory. Accepting the Meadowcroft evidence would require a fundamental restructuring of their understanding of human prehistory. The resistance was fierce and often personal, yet Adavasio and his team were not discouraged. Over the years and decades that followed, they continued to work on the site, refining their dating methods, conducting additional analyses, and addressing every criticism that was leveled against them. Multiple radiocarbon dating techniques were employed to verify the original findings. Stratigraphic analysis confirmed that the layers had not been disturbed and that the artifacts were found in their original depositional contexts. The team documented that the flora and fauna associated with the earliest dates were consistent with the climate conditions that prevailed during that period, not the Holocene as some critics had claimed. In 1999, 2 decades after the initial discoveries, Adovazio published a comprehensive paper titled 2 Decades of Debate on Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, in which he methodically addressed and refuted virtually every criticism that had been raised against the site. A major breakthrough in validating Meadowcroft's authenticity came in 2009, when micromorphological analysis of sediments from the site was conducted. This sophisticated technique involves examining soil samples under a microscope at high magnification to determine their composition and history. The analysis confirmed that the stratigraphic integrity of Meadowcroft was sound, that the layers were undisturbed, and that the old carbon contamination from coal humates was not sufficient to have significantly skewed the radiocarbon dates. This scientific validation did much to restore credibility to the Meadowcroft discoveries among the broader archaeological community. While some hardcore proponents of the Clovis first theory remained skeptical, the evidence for pre-Clovis occupation at Meadowcroft became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Over the years following the initial excavations that ran from 1973 through 1989, Meadowcroft continued to yield remarkable findings. The archaeological record revealed a continuous sequence of human occupation spanning nearly 16,000 years. Visitors who climb down into the rock shelter can see the layers of history stacked one atop another, from the deepest and oldest deposits to the more recent layers that show occupation during the historical period. The site is not just a single snapshot of ancient life. It is a chronicle, an archive of human history written in stone, bone, soil, and ash. It shows how populations changed over time, how technologies evolved, how cultures succeeded one another in occupation of this particular place. The significance of Meadowcroft extends far beyond its specific artifacts and dates. The site serves as a benchmark for evaluating other claims of pre-Clovis occupation throughout North America. Following Meadowcroft's discoveries, archaeologists began to look more carefully at other sites that had previously been dismissed as too old to be credible. Remarkably, they began to find confirmation. Other pre-Clovis sites in North America started to receive serious attention in scientific scrutiny. Sites like Cactus Hill in Virginia, the Topper site in South Carolina, and Monteverde in Chile revealed evidence that suggested human occupation extending back beyond the Clovis timeframe. Each discovery added weight to the conclusion that Meadowcroft had been correct all along. The Clovis first theory, once seemingly unassailable, began to crumble as evidence from multiple sites accumulated. The discovery also raises fascinating questions about the origins of later Clovis and Folsom cultures. Scholars have proposed that the fluted projectile point complexes characteristic of these later cultures might have derived from unfluted lanceolate points similar to those found at Meadowcroft. If true, this would suggest a direct cultural lineage stretching back thousands of years. It would mean that the pre-Clovis peoples of Meadowcroft were not some isolated anomaly or primitive precursor civilization, but rather the direct ancestors of the more well-known Clovis culture. This possibility represents a genuine revolution in our understanding of cultural development in North America. The story of human occupation becomes not a sudden arrival, but a gradual, continuous process of settlement, adaptation, and cultural evolution. Albert Miller did not live to see the full vindication of his discovery. He passed away before the scientific community fully accepted the importance and authenticity of Meadowcroft. But his legacy lives on in every artifact carefully preserved from the site, in every student who has learned about pre-Clovis occupation in North America, and in every visitor who walks beneath the rock shelter and stands in the presence of 19,000 years of human history. The Miller Lanceolate Point, named in his honor, stands as a permanent tribute to his curiosity, his patience, and his determination to share the secrets of his land with the world. Today, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and Historic Village welcomes visitors who wish to experience this remarkable site firsthand. The property is now operated by the Senator John Hines History Center, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. The rock shelter itself is preserved exactly as it was left by the archaeologists. Visitors can walk into the shelter and see the actual archaeological layers, understand how deep the human history at this location extends, and appreciate the remarkable preservation of evidence spanning nearly 16,000 years of human occupation. It is like stepping into a time machine, descending through layers of millennia. Beyond the rock shelter itself, the Meadowcroft property features several reconstructed historical villages that Albert Miller began creating decades ago. There is a recreation of a 16th century Monongahela Indian village, complete with authentic dwellings and artifacts that provide insight into how Native Americans lived before European contact. There is an 18th century trading post that represents the contact period between European traders and Native Americans, a time of complex interactions and exchange. There is also a 19th century rural village featuring a church, schoolhouse, blacksmith shop, and a log house that actually dates to 1800 and was built by Miller's grandfather. These reconstructions, while more modern than the rock shelter itself, serve an important educational purpose, helping visitors understand the continuity of human settlement in this region across different historical periods. The site also features a museum dedicated to the history of Meadowcroft and the excavations. The museum provides context and interpretation for the discoveries made at the rock shelter. While the actual artifacts recovered during excavations are not currently on permanent display at Meadowcroft itself, they can be seen through video presentations and educational materials. The museum also houses information about harness racing history, local barn architecture, farm implements, and carriages that reflect the rural heritage of western Pennsylvania. Additionally, visitors can see the Pine Bank Covered Bridge, another historic structure that has been preserved on the property. All of these elements together create a comprehensive educational experience that spans from the deepest prehistory of Meadowcroft to the recent historical past. Recent developments at Meadowcroft show that archaeological work continues into the 21st century. Excavations conducted in the 2020s and 2025s have continued to explore the deepest cultural layers of the site, yielding additional artifacts and refining our understanding of pre-Clovis occupation. While no significant new radiocarbon dates have been published as of 2025, the ongoing work demonstrates that Meadowcroft remains an active research site, and that much more can still be learned from the rock shelter. Archaeologists recognize that the site has not been exhausted, that deeper layers may still contain evidence that could further illuminate the lives of ancient peoples. An important development in recent years has been the involvement of descendant communities in the interpretation and study of Meadowcroft. Indigenous peoples, including the Delaware, Seneca, and Shawnee tribes, have become increasingly involved in discussions about the site and its significance. In 2025, public events including Native American heritage, month programming, and an October Archaeology Day workshop were held in collaboration with these descendant communities. This collaborative approach recognizes that Indigenous peoples have a stake in understanding their own deep history and that their perspectives and knowledge should be central to interpretation of pre-Clovis and early Native American sites. This inclusive approach to archaeology represents an important evolution in how we study and understand the past. The story of Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and the Groundhog Hole discovery challenges us to think about how knowledge is created and validated in science. It shows us the importance of being open to evidence that contradicts existing theories, no matter how firmly those theories seem to be established. It demonstrates the power of individual curiosity and determination to shape the course of scientific progress. It illustrates the way that evidence from the natural world can ultimately overcome even entrenched academic orthodoxy. Most importantly, it reminds us that human history is far deeper and more complex than we often assume. The 19,000 years of human occupation at Meadowcroft represent an enormous span of time. To put this in perspective, if we think of recorded human history as beginning approximately 5,000 years ago with the invention of writing, then Meadowcroft was inhabited for more than 3 times that length of time, before writing was even invented. It represents countless generations of humans living, dying, and passing down knowledge to their descendants. It encompasses vast changes in climate, environment, culture, and technology. It contains the accumulated wisdom and experience of thousands upon thousands of people who called this place home. The Groundhog Hole that Albert Miller discovered in 1955 was not the first time that humans had disturbed the ground at Meadowcroft. For thousands of years, people had walked this landscape, used this rock shelter for shelter and survival, left behind evidence of their presence in the form of tools, bones, and ashes. The groundhog, in burrowing through the soil, simply happened to bring some of that ancient evidence to the surface where Albert Miller could see it. In a sense, the groundhog performed an archaeological excavation of its own, tunneling through time and bringing the past into view. Without the groundhog's curiosity, without the happenstance of its burrow breaking through ancient layers, the discovery might have been delayed for years or even decades, or it might never have happened at all. This remarkable story reminds us that discoveries are not always made in planned, controlled ways. Sometimes they happen by accident, by chance encounters that seem mundane at first, but ultimately prove to be transformative. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs in our understanding come not from expensive expeditions or grand research programs, but from the simple observation of a careful person paying attention to the world around them. Albert Miller's willingness to notice something unusual, his restraint in not immediately publicizing his discovery, and his persistence in seeking proper scientific validation all played crucial roles in ensuring that Meadowcroft became one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. The Meadowcroft Rock Shelter stands today as a monument not just to ancient peoples, but to the triumph of curiosity, evidence, and scientific truth over entrenched belief and conventional wisdom. It stands as a reminder that our understanding of history is always incomplete, that new evidence can appear at any time to reshape our understanding of the past and that the human story is far deeper and more complex than we often realize. The Groundhog hole in Pennsylvania that seemed so insignificant in 1955 ultimately changed the way we understand human history itself. It challenged what the world thought it knew and forced the scientific community to confront the limits of its knowledge and reconsider its most basic assumptions about when and how humans first came to North America. In doing so, Albert Miller and the Groundhog that started it all contributed far more than they could have imagined to our collective human understanding. Their story is one of those remarkable moments where curiosity, chance, and persistence combine to illuminate the deep past and rewrite the story of humanity.